I'm Dr. Leslie Kernisan, board-certified geriatrician and founder of the website betterhealthwhileaging.net. And this is the Helping Older Parents video podcast, where I cover the best ways to support aging parents and other older loved ones so they can live better lives in their later years. I also often address common caregiving concerns and dilemmas, like what to do if you're worried about an older person's memory or safety, how to deal with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, and how to help your older loved one get the care they need. In this episode, I'm going to talk about something that is very important to learn about if you are dealing with ongoing memory decline or a diagnosis such as Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. And that is how to recognize signs that an older person might be losing their decision-making capacity, and what to do if you think this might be happening to your aging parent or older loved one. People sometimes refer to this as becoming mentally incompetent, but in my field, we actually prefer to use the term capacity or lack of capacity. Either way, the practical issue at hand is this. If an older person is often confused or very forgetful or showing other signs of thinking problems, then is it still okay for them to make decisions that might have consequences for themselves or for others? For instance, is it okay for them to decide to keep driving, even though it seems obviously unsafe, or to refuse to go to the doctor, even though they seem obviously unwell? Or is it okay for them to decide to sell their house or make a similar major decision with financial consequences? And what if they're very frail and struggling to manage their daily life activities, yet they're still insisting that they can keep living at home on their own? And especially if they've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia, at what point can we know if it's not okay to let them make these decisions? So this question of whether someone has decision-making capacity is really important. In fact, when the American Bar Association created a tip sheet several years ago of 10 legal tips for caregivers, they put understand decisional capacity as tip number 1. Because here's the deal. In the United States, adults have a fundamental right to individual autonomy, which means they're allowed to make decisions that put themselves at risk or that their family members don't like. But there's a big exception to the right to autonomy, especially in situations where cognition is impaired. The person making the decision has to have the mental capacity necessary to understand what's going on and to make a reasonably informed decision. If a person appears to be lacking the needed mental capacity to understand their situation and the likely consequences of their actions, then it often becomes more ethically permissible to intervene and maybe even to override their decision. Lack of capacity can also activate a power of attorney document or even help justify a more significant legal intervention into an older person's affairs, such as getting guardianship. So in the rest of this episode, I'm going to help you understand decisional capacity. Now, let me preface this by saying that I am not an attorney, and also questions of capacity are usually ultimately governed by state law. So if you have a significant concern about an older person's decision-making abilities, especially as it relates to legal matters or significant financial transactions, I highly recommend you consider consulting with a qualified attorney based in your state. That said, because memory loss and thinking problems often affect decision-making, in geriatrics, considering decisional capacity is a big part of our work, and so I've learned a fair bit about it over the years. So in this video, I'm going to give you an overview, as I agree with the American Bar Association that families need to understand the basics of decisional capacity. Specifically, I'm going to cover what does it mean to have the capacity to make a decision, how to know if an older person might be losing decision-making capacity, what's the difference between incapacity and incompetence, who usually assesses capacity, and when does the legal system get involved, and what to do if you're concerned about an aging parent's decisions. Okay, let's start with what is decisional capacity and what does it mean to have it? Let's consider an example. Let's say that your 87-year-old mother, Mary, lives alone and has been falling repeatedly, but she refuses to go see a doctor. In this case, we might consider whether she has the capacity to make an informed decision to refuse to see the doctor. It's especially vital to do this if Mary has been showing any signs of memory or thinking problems, or if she's been diagnosed with a dementia, such as Alzheimer's. When we ask whether a person has the capacity to make a given decision, we're asking whether they can show us that he or she has the mental abilities necessary to make the decision in an informed fashion. Generally, capacity requires that individuals be able to understand the situation they're in, the decision in question, the pros and cons of the available options, and the likely consequences for them of making a given choice. The person should also be able to explain their reasoning and express the choice to others, and the reasoning shouldn't rely on anything that strikes most people as bizarre or delusional. In the scholarly literature on the topic of capacity, experts have identified 4 decision-making abilities that together constitute capacity. They are understanding, which means understanding the situation and decision; expressing a choice, which means being able to clearly express what one wants; appreciation, which means understanding how the facts pertain to one's own situation; and reasoning, which means being able to compare options and understand the pros and cons of the available options. Now, people sometimes get confused. What is the difference between capacity and cognition? Well, they are not the same thing. Cognition refers more broadly to memory and thinking abilities, basically to the work that your brain does when it comes to thinking. Whereas capacity, in this situation, refers to being able to use relevant cognitive abilities to make a particular decision in a reasonably informed manner. Now, although they're not the same thing, they're certainly related, because when memory and other thinking abilities are being disrupted by a problem affecting brain function, this can definitely affect decisional capacity. So, especially if an older person has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, it's reasonable to expect that over time, they'll experience a decrease in decision capacity. In fact, as dementia progresses, if the person lives long enough to reach an advanced stage, they'll lose the capacity to make all their decisions. Now, before we go on, let me tell you about 2 things that are really important to understand when it comes to capacity. The first is that capacity is supposed to be decision-specific. This means a person's capacity should be evaluated in light of a specific decision to be made. This is especially important to remember when it comes to older adults who are in the earlier stages of Alzheimer's or related dementia, or maybe have some other form of cognitive impairment. So for instance, if you're concerned about your parents' decision to keep driving, then we'll need to assess their capacity to assess and decide whether it's safe for they themselves to keep driving. Whereas if you're concerned about them wanting to sell their house, we need to assess how well they understand the risks of selling the house and the benefits of selling the house, and are they able to manage that type of major financial transaction. As you can imagine, some decisions are much more complicated to consider than others. So it's quite possible for a person with memory loss to still have the capacity to make certain types of decisions, such as appointing a preferred family member to be their power of attorney, while they still at the same time might lack the capacity to make a much more complicated decision, like whether to get a reverse mortgage. In other words, capacity is often not an all or nothing, you either have it or you don't kind of thing. If we are concerned about capacity, we should always be asking capacity to do or decide what. The second very important thing you should understand about capacity is that it can fluctuate, depending on a person's health circumstances, state of mind, or other factors. So, for example, most people are quite drowsy after a surgery. In this state, even somebody who is otherwise healthy and normal might lack the capacity to address anything more than a very simple decision. But their decisional capacity will improve as they mentally recover from the surgery and recover from the anesthesia. For older adults with chronic memory loss or thinking problems, their decisional capacity can easily be affected by things like whether they're rested or tired at the time of considering the decision, whether they're taking medications that affect brain function, whether they're experiencing hearing difficulty or vision problems, we call these sensory impairment factors, and whether they're sick or delirious. So when we're considering questions of capacity, we want to consider them in light of the decision or situation in question. And since capacity can fluctuate, when we assess capacity, we want to consider whether there are temporary health or sensory impairment factors that are currently impairing the older person's ability to make decisions. So, now that I've explained what is decisional capacity, how can we know if an older person is losing their decision-making capacity? So, basically, we need to talk to the older person, ask some questions, and figure out what is their understanding of things like the situation they're in, the decision in question, the pros and cons of the available options, and the likely consequences for them of making a given choice. Now, capacity is technically supposed to be assessed by professionals, and later in this video, I'll tell you more about what that often looks like. But obviously, the people most likely to notice an older person making questionable decisions are going to be family, not professionals. So, unless you're a trained professional, you should not attempt to make a definitive capacity determination on your own. But if you've been worried about your aging parents' decisions or about another older loved one's decisions, I believe you can and should ask yourself the following questions. Do they seem to understand the situation and the related risks? Do they seem to understand the decision or choice at hand? Can they explain the pros and cons for managing the situation or the decision? Do they seem to understand the likely consequences for them of making a given choice? If your older loved one seems to be lacking the needed understanding for a certain situation or decision, then it would be reasonable for you to conclude that maybe their decisional capacity is impaired for this decision, and then you can try to get professional help assessing this. So, let's now return to the example of 87-year-old Mary, who has been falling repeatedly, but has been refusing to go see a doctor about it. How might we check to see if she understands the situation and is making an informed decision? Well, first of all, if you mention a recent fall to her, does she remember that she fell and what happened afterwards? If an older person keeps forgetting they fell, then their understanding of the situation does become questionable. Similarly, if Mary can't acknowledge or understand that she could fall again and get hurt, that also suggests poor insight into the risks of the situation. And if she can't acknowledge that seeing the doctor might reduce her risk, that would suggest that she has an inadequate understanding of the pros and cons of the available options. And so you might conclude that perhaps she's lacking capacity to make an informed choice when she refuses to see the doctor for her falling problem. Now, in a moment, I'm going to explain some options for getting capacity assessed. But first, I want to address a very common question, which is, what is the difference between incapacity and incompetence? So, historically, the term competence was used in legal settings, and the term capacity was used in clinical settings, such as with doctors and psychologists. And so the legal determination of competence was related to whether a person had the legal right to continue to make their own decisions. And this was usually informed by a clinical assessment of capacity, which meant that lawyers or judges had asked a clinician, such as a psychologist or a physician, to give an opinion regarding the person's decisional capacity and the reasons for any impairment. Hence, there are still some doctors or other clinicians who will say that they can't assess someone's competence, they can only assess their capacity as regards a given decision or life function. However, in the past several years, states have been moving away from global legal determinations that a person is incompetent, because this often meant the loss of virtually all control over one's affairs. And instead, states are increasingly favoring determinations of incapacity for certain types of decisions or life functions. Hence, the old convention of using competence for the legal arena and capacity for the clinical one no longer works really well. Instead, professionals now tend to refer to legal capacity versus clinical capacity, and the terms competence and incompetence have become a bit dated. If you would like to learn more about legal capacity, I have links to some useful resources at the end of my related article on better health while aging. Let's now come back to decisional capacity. Once people learn about this concept, their next question often is, so how do I get my parent assessed? If you are concerned about your older parents making legal decisions, or your older spouse or loved one, then technically, the attorneys involved should be able to help check whether your parent appears to have legal capacity. If they're not sure, they may refer your older loved one for a clinical capacity assessment. These are often done by psychologists who specialize in these types of capacity assessments. However, regular physicians can also be involved in capacity assessments. Generally, physicians have had some training on how to check whether a patient can give informed consent for certain types of medical care, such as procedures or surgeries. Physicians are also sometimes asked to give an opinion as to whether their patient has capacity or is incapacitated. For instance, many power of attorney documents are drafted with a springing provision, specifying that the agent's authority to act only becomes effective upon incapacity. For instance, here's language from an actual recent California power of attorney drafted by a lawyer. I am incapacitated whenever 2 licensed physicians provide written opinions that I cannot effectively manage my property or financial affairs due to age, illness, use of prescription medications, drugs or other substances, or any other cause. Now, I actually don't like the language in that power of attorney document because it's actually completely ageist to list age as a reason that someone might not be able to manage their affairs. But you get the idea. 2 licensed physicians need to provide a written opinion to trigger the incapacity provision in this legal document and allow someone else to manage affairs on behalf of the older person. So it is common, for this reason, for physicians to be involved in some capacity assessments. The trouble with asking physicians to render an opinion on capacity, however, is that most of them have not had significant training in how to do this. So in the real world, they may or may not do it. And if they do it, it's not always done in accordance with what are considered best practices by experts. Now, some doctors will actually refer to a neuropsychologist for the capacity assessment. This is good in that those professionals usually do have good training and experience. However, it also means that it takes longer to get a capacity assessment done. And of course, if you're in one of those situations where your aging parent is resisting getting an evaluation, an additional referral can be another difficult hurdle to overcome. That said, if you're concerned about your parent's decision-making capacity, I do recommend notifying your parent's usual health provider of your concerns. Even if they don't feel comfortable fully assessing your parent's decision-making capacity, it's good for your parent's doctors to know that you have concerns about their ability to make decisions. And your loved one's doctors may be able to support your family in other ways. So to recap, decisional capacity refers to a person's ability to understand the situation they're in, the decision in question, the pros and cons of the available options, and the likely consequences for them of making a given choice. Adults can experience temporary declines in decisional capacity when their thinking abilities are impaired by illness. Chronic conditions that affect memory and thinking, such as Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, can affect decisional capacity in the early stages. These conditions will definitely impair decision capacity as they progress. Remember, capacity is decision-specific, so a person with cognitive impairment, or even an Alzheimer's diagnosis, can have capacity for certain decisions, yet lack the capacity for other more complicated decisions. It really all depends on the decision and how complicated it is, and on what kinds of thinking skills are required to consider it. The most thorough capacity assessments are done by trained clinicians, such as certain psychologists. However, physicians are sometimes asked to render opinions on capacity, especially when it comes to springing powers of attorney. And lawyers may assess legal capacity when helping clients transact legal business. If your older loved one has been experiencing memory loss or thinking problems, and you've been concerned about bad decisions, I hope this episode has helped you understand the concept of decisional capacity a little better. If you'd like to learn more about capacity issues, I have a related article on better health while aging, which includes links to other online resources, and I'll link to that article in the notes for this episode. Or, for more on how to help a parent with memory loss, just be sure to subscribe to this channel, as I'll be covering more in the coming months on how to address the most common caregiving challenges. So with that, thank you so much for watching. We geriatricians couldn't do what we do without you. And if you found this video podcast helpful, if you're here on YouTube, please go ahead and subscribe. It helps more people find the channel. If you've been listening to the audio version on the podcast feed, come take a look at the video if you get a chance. You'll see my key points being displayed on the screen. So thank you, take care, and I look forward to seeing you all again on a future episode of the Helping Older Parents video podcast.